I've spent several days of the past week testing out the brand new DJI Action 2. Now, I would have had this video published sooner, but unfortunately, the Action 2 and I got off to a bad start. After fully charging it, updating the firmware, and registering it with DJI, I powered it on, got all ready to shoot, and unfortunately, I was greeted with the following. Yep, it was toast. So I had to go and buy another one for $519, and then I had to start a return on the first one I bought. The good news is the second one did work. After fully charging it, updating the firmware, and registering it, the screen looked normal and the camera functioned normally. So at that point, I was able to get out there and test it. So anyway, I did test out the DJI Action 2, and the version of it that I tested is the version with the front-facing screen module. This is the only version that DJI has released so far. The other version of the camera is going to be the camera that has the battery module on the bottom, but does not have the screen. So on both sides, this module is going to look like this when it's released. This one costs $519. The other one that DJI will be releasing just with the battery, that one will cost $399. So now that I've spent approximately 20 hours with the camera, testing it out in the field, I wanted to provide you with my impressions of what is good about this camera, what is bad about this camera, and what is downright ugly about this camera. That way you can make an informed decision as to whether the DJI Action 2 is for you, or if you want to look at a competing product. Now, I will say up front, anytime I test a new product, I do want to like it. It's exciting to test new innovative products, and I want to like them. But at the same time, I'm going to put it through all of the tests, and I'm going to do my best to find everything I like and don't like about the camera. All right, so first of all, let's talk about what I do like. The first thing I like about this camera is the size. This camera is really small. It's got that nice cube shape to it. Any of you that remember the GoPro Hero Session, this camera looks a lot like that. It's got that boxy look to it. And it is nice and small. It's very light, but it still has that solid feeling to it. It's got the metal around the outside. So it doesn't feel like it's cheap plastic. It does have a good feel to it. And for a size comparison, this is the Action 2 next to the Hero 10. The Action 2 is about the size of the lens on the Hero 10, if that gives you a size comparison. The Hero 10 is obviously significantly bigger initially. However, if you add the screen module to this, the size becomes not so small. If you put these next to each other, it is about the same size that way. And then if you add the mount on the bottom with the magnet, it starts to become a little bit ridiculous looking. When I was testing this out, I had it vertically on my mount next to this. I had them side by side, filming comparative footage, and it looked a little bit ridiculous with this camera here. Now, if I was to mount it like this, it would look pretty normal and be great. One of my favorite things about this camera is the magnets. The modular nature in the magnets, it's a lot of fun just clicking them. I like that sound. The magnets are very strong on here too. The next thing I like about the Action 2 is the touchscreen is really responsive. When you click on something, it responds right away. You don't really have to click multiple times. That is one thing that DJI did well with this camera starting off, so I do appreciate that. Another good about it, the actual camera module unit does have built-in storage. It's 32 gigabytes of storage technically, but you're only able to use 22.4 of that. So the reason I put this under the good is if you happen to forget your micro SD card, you at least have some storage in here. Now, if you are shooting in 4K, it is important to note that 22.4 gigabytes is not going to go far. If you're shooting in 4K 120, that's probably going to at most get you about 17 or 18 minutes of video before it fills up. Another good feature, this camera is waterproof. But do note, it's only the camera module that's waterproof. Any of the add-ons are not waterproof. So this front screen one or the battery module that's going to be released later on is not waterproof. Another positive is the audio is pretty good on this camera. Thanks to the mic placement on here, there's quite a few mics, and then when you add on the module, there are quite a few more mics on this screen module. They're placed kind of all around here and spread out in strategic locations. I did find the audio was as good, or maybe slightly better than the Hero 10 on here. One more good item about this camera is it does have the option to film in D-Cine-like for the color mode. D-Cine-like does offer you a lot more control over your final footage. This is going to be comparable to the flat mode on the GoPro. If you film in D-Cine-like and you want to color correct later on, it's going to offer you the opportunity to have a lot better looking footage. So props to DJI for including that. Now let's talk about the bad on the Action 2. Unfortunately, there are quite a few items here, and I want to go through those. The first item is there is no micro SD slot on the actual camera module. So if you want to add a micro SD card on here, you don't have that option. You have to have this connected, and the slot for the micro SD is right down here on the bottom. So you pop it out right there, and that's where it goes in. Now what I did find odd is there is no cover for the micro SD slot either. DJI does say this bottom module is not waterproof, but my thoughts are even if you get a little bit of water splashing in here or rain, it could ruin your micro SD card and you could lose all of your footage. So unfortunately, that would kind of go along with this in the bad category. And if you do want to use the Action camera in the water, that is a serious limiting factor that only this part is waterproof. That means if you're filming in 4K, you're going to be really limited to how much footage you can get with only 22.4 gigabytes of internal storage. You're also not going to have a front-facing screen if you're vlogging. So if you're outside in the rain or the snow or underwater, it's a limiting factor that this part of it is not waterproof. Another item in the bad category is the battery life. Now DJI does talk about how good the battery life is with this attached, because this has the extra battery, but the battery life that they specify on their website is for the 1080 mode. What they don't specify is if you're filming in 4K, the battery is obviously going to get used up a lot quicker. Now what I found is I had both the camera module and the bottom battery and screen module fully charged. When I was out filming side by side with the Hero 10, I had both of them in the 4K 120 mode. The batteries ran out just about a minute apart. And this one actually ran out before my Hero 10. And the Hero 10 has had its shares of complaints about battery life. So don't get me wrong on that. I'm not saying the Hero 10 is perfect, but for them touting the extra value of this battery module and it running out at about the same time as the Hero 10, I found that to definitely be in the bad category. Another bad about this camera is there are no removable batteries. If you want extra batteries to bring along, you have to buy more of these modules. This module with the screen costs $169, but the battery modules without the screen cost $75 each. So if you wanted to go out and shoot all day, you would need several batteries to go along with this. So if you are used to having 4 or 5 batteries with your camera, that's going to add up really quickly. If you're buying the battery modules, you can have extra batteries, but you're not going to have the screen available when you pop on the battery module. If you buy extra screen and battery modules, they're going to cost $169 each. So that is something to keep in mind. 4 extra batteries at $75 each is going to cost $300. Whereas with other competing Action cameras that have removable batteries, those batteries cost around $20 to $25. So that does make this cost prohibitive to have extra batteries. Now sure, you could connect an external battery pack with it plugged into the USB slot here, but the external battery pack is going to have a certain size to it as well, and it's going to make this less portable. So do keep that in mind. So something else I was not particularly a fan of on here is the menus. So what I mean by that is on a lot of other Action cameras, all the settings you're going to need to configure your shoot are right there in one place. But on here, I found that I had to do a lot of swiping and pulling from all different directions to find all the settings I needed. Now you can configure the settings on the DJI Mimo app, which is great, but even on there, you do have to click and swipe around. Whereas with some of the competing Action cameras like the GoPro, in general, the settings you're going to want to change before filming are right there in one place. So I did find that to kind of be negative about this. The menus are not intuitive at all, from my opinion. The next item that I consider a negative about this camera is the lens is not replaceable. If you drop this camera or run into something with it and scratch this lens here, the camera is useless. You will have to buy a whole new camera, whereas some of the competitors have removable lenses that cost about $20. So do keep that in mind for an action camera where you're probably going to be doing a lot of action outside and moving around fast and putting this through a lot of elements. If it does get scratched, you cannot remove it and replace it. Another negative about this camera is the highest resolution on it is 4K 120. Now 4K 120 is great, don't get me wrong, but this is 2021, almost 2022, and several competitors are way beyond the 4K 120. And DJI had waited 2 years to release their new camera. My hopes were that in those 2 years, they could have offered at least something in the 5K range. So the 4K 120 was honestly kind of underwhelming and disappointing. Another negative about this is if you're filming in 4K 120, you're not able to see yourself on the screen that's meant for vlogging. On this screen module, all it shows is a red dot and a 4K 120. So if I'm looking here to vlog, you can see it on the back part of the screen, but if I have the camera facing toward me and I want to talk to it and see what I'm getting in my shot, all I see is a red dot and a 4K 120. That is a big negative. When you're paying $519 for the entire kit and you're paying the extra money for the screen module, you would expect to be able to see yourself in all modes on that camera. On other cameras like the Hero 10, you can see yourself at all times on this front screen, even when you're in 5.3K 60 frames per second. So those are the bad items. Let's talk about the really unfortunate ugly items about this camera. So the initial firmware setup process is full of glitchiness. This is the process of installing the DJI app, updating the firmware, and registering the device. The app installs pretty well. It does take a little bit to download and install because the app is rather large. But once you get to the process of connecting this via Bluetooth and Wi-Fi to your phone to push the firmware update, that's when things start to head south in a hurry. I had to do about 4 or 5 different tries to keep this connected to update the firmware. And then when the firmware did update, it said it was finished on the phone, but the camera was still spinning and updating the firmware. The camera restarted, and then the firmware still showed it was updating for about another minute. And this was on both cameras, by the way. The first one that ended up being broken when I went to use it, and then the second one that was not broken. So something DJI needs to improve is how it shows the firmware updating status. Another unfortunate ugly about this camera is this camera does overheat. So overheating is something that gets talked about a lot with action cameras. Most of them will overheat, especially if used indoors and stationary for a certain amount of time. However, this one, when I was filming in 4K 120, I was using it outdoors while moving on a day where the temperature was around 75. It overheated to the extent that it flashed the error message and it powered off. Now this is an action camera. Primary purpose of action cameras is to use them in a filming outdoor situation. So I would not expect this to overheat in that situation, and unfortunately it did. So that is something I think DJI needs to address, and they need to provide a fix for that. Because there's going to be a lot of unhappy people if they can't film in 4K 120 outdoors without it overheating. The third unfortunate ugly on this camera is the error messages that I received while filming with one of the recommended micro SD cards on the DJI site. DJI has a limited list of micro SD cards that are fully compatible with this. However, one of those cards, the Samsung that I own, is not fully compatible. If you're shooting in 4K 120, the write speed on that card cannot keep up with the camera. So the camera is trying to write to that card, but the speeds on the card for the writing are not fast enough. So what it'll do is the Action 2 will stop recording, and if you're not paying attention, you could easily not realize that and you could miss out on footage. So when I put in my SamDisk Extreme card, that worked fine. I didn't receive any messages in 4K 120. But with the recommended Samsung card on their site, which I have the exact model of, it does not work consistently in 4K 120. So DJI should make sure they update their website so that consumers are not using that card, because there's going to be a lot of disappointment there as well. So these are my final thoughts on the DJI Action 2. DJI first released their Osmo Action camera back in 2019. And that camera did pretty well. There was some initial front screen glitchiness, but overall, DJI released firmware and fixed that, and it became a pretty popular camera, and they did drop the price on that. I believe you can get that for $199 new now, which is a great price. But considering DJI had not released a new action camera for 2 years, I had high expectations for the Action 2. I was expecting something new, something revolutionary, something that made it a real competitor to the other action cameras. Now, the modular features like this with the magnets, that is pretty neat innovation. However, the cons of this and how it was implemented do not make this very useful. When you have to have these if you want the full functionality, that's something like the Hero 10 offers all in one package. So overall, I found the Action 2 to be rather underwhelming. It offers 4K 120, which is great, but so do a lot of other action cameras. 4K 120 is not something that revolutionary in the year 2021. I really wanted to like this camera. I like innovation and I love trying out new things, but unfortunately this camera doesn't really offer anything that other action cameras don't. And this camera comes at a higher price than most of the other action cameras. It's not fully waterproof with all features, and all features are not built into a single unit. And unfortunately, the bad and the ugly things about this camera do not make it a camera I'm going to reach for first when I'm heading out on an adventure. I will be releasing another video very soon where I compared the footage from this to the GoPro Hero 10 so that you can have an in-depth view of how these two cameras compare to each other. I also have lots of footage samples so that you can see what the footage looks like on here as you continue to decide if any of these action cameras are right for you. I know this review may have sounded a little harsh to the Action 2, but I want to be forthright and upfront with you as to what my opinions were about this camera in order to help you make an informed decision. If you found this video to be helpful, please slam that like button. If you haven't already subscribed, I'd love to have you on board. Please hit that subscribe and bell notification button, and you'll be notified every time I publish a new video. I look forward to talking again real soon.